and to you, Sandy Sasso, for the masterful reading of your most recent book, Cain and Abel. What a powerful message for what we see going on in our world today. Tell us how you first were inspired, though, to write the book.
Well, I was always fascinated by the story of Cain and Abel. It seemed to be dealing with a perennial issue. How do we respond when life is unfair? What do we do when we get angry? How do we react to situations where we feel resentful? We feel that we're not the favored one. So the story really resonated with me, and I was seeing around me so much violence in schools and on the streets, and I wondered if we could explore this story more deeply to help parents and children and teachers and all of us talk about anger. Anger is such a natural emotion. The question is, what do we do with that anger, and how do we channel it constructively so it doesn't grow into hate and then into violence, which is, of course, what happens in this story.
Violence such as in the Columbine High School incident and so many others in our country. However, you said to me earlier that this book, Cain and Abel, came out on September 10th.
I did receive the first unbound copies of the book on September 10th. And then, of course, September 11th happened, and the story took on an even broader meaning and a very powerful message, I believe, because it was raising the whole issue of how one killing becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 16, and how entire worlds are destroyed.
I recently heard one child say, when talking about the image of God, said, I think God has something of every one of us on him, which would imply what we're seeing now in our world is a civil war. Are these the kinds of ideas that you can talk about with children when they're reading your book?
Yes. I mean, we often don't give children enough credit for profound thinking. Children have a very deep spiritual imagination, and they ask some of the same questions we ask. Why are we here? What's our purpose? Why do we live and die? Why is there good and evil? Does there always have to be war? And I think that we need to honor our children's imagination and their capacity to deal with complex issues, like the issues that Cain and Abel addresses. Because our children want to talk about these issues, we just have to give them permission and provide the opportunity for that kind of conversation.
And in the book, you describe so beautifully how even the trees were mourning. I mean, those images are so strong.
That was a very powerful image for me. I was reading in the literature of the rabbis, the Midrash, which said that the trees went into mourning when Cain killed Abel, that the world somehow is so different when violence enters in it. And in fact, we could hardly imagine what the world might have been like before violence came into the world with Cain's murder of Abel. And so that's what I was trying to do, imagine another kind of world without violence. Because I believe if we can imagine another kind of world, we can make it so.
And so the underlying connectedness of everything in our world, as we're talking about nurturing the spiritual journey of our children. Talk more about your book, God's Paintbrush. I think that was your first book.
Yes.
I recall a passage, a child looking out the window recites a sunbeam peeked through his window and painted a rainbow. And
yes, God's Paintbrush was my first children's book, and what I was trying to do is help children have a conversation about God and to see God in everyday events, such as learning to ride a bicycle, perhaps getting lost in a store, having a friend move away from the neighborhood. Where was God in their everyday lives? And God's Paintbrush is a series of vignettes, and each vignette ends with a question. And the question asks a child to have a conversation about where they experience God in their everyday lives. And the wonderful thing about this book is that children love the questions. Whenever a child tells me what they like about the book, they said, I like the questions. I want to talk about these issues. And they often haven't had that opportunity before.
And the questions are introspective. The simple, piercing honesty of children teaches all of us as adults, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You know, we're all on a spiritual journey, but if we would take the hand of a child, we would help our journey along the way, because our children have this incredible sense of wonder and spontaneity, and just as they can learn from us, we can learn something from their wondrous view of the world.
Children's literature, Sandy, and narratives such as you have shared are a marvelous vehicle for expression of Jewish values, but much broader than Jewish. It seems to encompass human values that bring us all together.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about stories that are paradigms for all of the emotions that we feel, particularly when we talk about biblical stories. And it doesn't attach to any one particular religion, because it addresses us across all religious lines. We express our spiritual souls in a particular religious tradition, but we all have the same spiritual questions, and narratives really help us explore those questions in very deep ways.
I want to talk about your own spiritual soul. You have written, if in Bible stories, if women could pour their soul into those stories that often leave them invisible,
yes.
How would it be different?
Well, it's a wonderful question, and it's something I love to do. Often when we look at biblical narrative, we don't really hear women's voices. Sometimes we don't even know women's names. We certainly don't know their stories. And if we can breathe a woman's breath into those stories, we would find a whole new world, a whole new way of looking at things. And I just love to kind of fill in those blank spaces where we don't know exactly what women were thinking or feeling. It opens up a whole new way of looking at the biblical story, and it allows us to read our story into the ancient narrative.
Sandy Sasso, your story, what inspired you to become a rabbi in 10 seconds?
Well, I loved Judaism, I loved teaching, I loved writing, I loved being with people, and it seemed being a rabbi was just the right thing to do.
Well, you have inspired us all. Thank you so much for your